Hi, everyone, and welcome to Fired Up, our first Fired Up of 2023. I'm really excited to be continuing this program for the Art Alliance of Contemporary Glass, our educational program on glass art that is free and open to the public. So if you know of anyone that might be interested in the programs, please go ahead and share the link when you see the Fired Up program advertised. Today, we have a special guest that I'm super excited about, Caterina, whatever you choose to call her, Urrata Weintraub. She is an artist that knows many disciplines within glass. So flame working, glass blowing, kiln casting. And you're going to see the way that she works with those different methodologies to compose beautiful narrative works, whimsical pieces, things that evoke memories of her childhood. And just really an exceptional artist that I've followed for quite some time. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things over. Please go ahead, Trina.
All right, everyone can hear me all right? Awesome. All right, so Dimitri did just give me my intro, but I thought I would reintroduce myself because I am a girl with many names. So my real name is Caterina, but everyone calls me Trina. I'm not even sure if I would answer to, let me make this work for a second. Answer to Caterina sometimes. There we go. So I actually, when I was making my Instagram account, I wasn't sure what name to use. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to use both names, Trina, Caterina. And it's funny because now when I meet new people, they actually come up to me and call me Trina, Caterina. But everyone calls me Trina, and you guys are welcome to as well. So I thought I would start with a little background, a little bio. I began working with glass around 2004 or so. I can't quite remember exactly when, and it started with a bead making class. I just really wanted to learn about glass, and I was honestly super nervous to take my first class, and I made my sister come along with me, and she was awesome at it at first. She made a really perfect, awesome bead on her first try, and I was terrible, but it didn't matter because I was just completely hooked. And shortly after that, I actually set up a little flame working studio in my dad's shed. Hold on, I'm just going to get that out of the way. And a few years after just kind of working in the shed, and I took a few classes, some with Sally Prash, who's here today. Hey, Sally, thank you. I ended up leading me to take a class with my now husband and forever teacher, Dave Weintraub. And he, on one of our first dates, he brought me to Mass College of Art, where he showed me the glass hot shop. I had never seen any glass working besides flame working before, and I had been working on a pretty small scale. So when he brought me into the hot shop and showed me he pulled cane and made a really big, beautiful vase, I was just completely blown away. So I pretty much marched right down to the office and got an application and went to Mass Art. Since then, I got my BFA from there, obviously, and I've been teaching there as an adjunct professor for the past 8 years or so. So together we own and run a studio in Waltham, Mass called Fiamma Glass. And I have to give a quick shout out to my studio mates and studio assistants, Alex, Tessa, Tara, and Max, who are the very best people to work with. At our studio, during the week, we do a lot of our own work. We do some commissions, we work on our sculptures. My husband makes a lot of tools for glass blowers as well. And on the weekends, we're open up to the public for classes where we do intro through advanced classes and lessons. So I have my work separated in a few different series. And the first series I'm going to share with you guys is based on memories and dreams and those weird, strange moments in between them. I feel like when I was first trying to figure out where to draw inspiration from, memories and dreams were a perfect place to start because they're so individual and so personal to each person. This piece is titled My Deer. It's the twins. It's actually the third set of cast glass deer marionettes that I've made, and they're actually quite large. And they were inspired by the memory of when I was a kid, my dad, well, he's still a hunter, but when I was a kid and he first started hunting, he would come home with a deer on the hood of his truck, which I know to some people might sound like a really normal thing. But I grew up in a suburb just outside of Boston, and it was not at all a normal thing for someone to pull up with the deer on the hood of their truck. So it was the first time I had seen a wild animal up close and personal, and I was just completely mesmerized by it. So I think when I was designing and making these pieces, I didn't realize that that's where the inspiration came from until I was working on it. And it was a way for me to bring that deer back to life. And as you can see in this picture, it's actually quite large. These pieces are all movable, just like a real marionette. You can move all the elements around to kind of play with them and pose them. Although I don't recommend you do that for the obvious reason they're made out of glass and you don't really want to play with them. But you could, but you shouldn't. This is swing. I actually had first made this piece as an undergrad at Mass Art, but I loved it so much I wanted to remake it because my skills just got so much better years and years later after a lot of practice. And it's composed of two 13-foot glass chains. It doesn't look that long in this picture because I took this picture in my studio and my studio ceilings are not super duper high. But the length of the chains can be changed depending where it's displayed. But these ones in particular are 13 feet long each. So it took a long time to make each chain. The seat is slumped glass, and right beneath the swing where your feet would normally kick away, the dirt or the grass that's there as you swung is over 450 glass flowers. And this piece is actually really special to me. It was one of the first installations I had ever made. And I set it up at Mass Art, and it was just like so hectic and crazy setting this piece up, you know, end of semester, all that craziness you feel. And I remember leaving the room, doing whatever I had to do and coming back in and seeing this piece with fresh eyes and just feeling like I made something that was completely separate from myself. And it was the first time I had felt that. And it had just like completely transformed a space. So I knew then and there that I just wanted to make more installation size pieces. And here's a close-up of the flowers. And like I mentioned, there's over 450 of them, which is a lot. Thankfully, I had my assistant, Alex, help me make a lot of the petals and some of the flowers too. Packing these was also a whole nother adventure. This is another set of the puppets. This one is titled Day, and it is two Italian Greyhound marionettes, and it's modeled off of my sister's Italian Greyhound. The one she has now is named Stella. The original one she had got was this little Italian Greyhound named Emma. And I can remember I was a teenager, so a young teenager, and she had called me and was like, Trina, come home, I got a puppy. Come play with this puppy. It's gonna be so awesome and so fun. So you picture this adorable, fluffy, fun puppy to go play with. So I like run home to see this puppy, and she hands me the leash, but except what comes out is like this deer rat like little creature just like prancing around and wrapping its leash all around me. So that memory just really stuck with me, and I just fell in love with this dog. They're beautiful animals, and I love that they're so skinny and so bony, so I can study and look at her anatomy without having to look at skeletons and study the anatomy in a more like book type way. I can just go and spend time with this dog, which I did a lot when I was sculpting these. And again, they're all totally movable and posable, just like the deer. And these pieces I made and shown just right before COVID. So I only got to show them once at a show with Habitat, so they are still available. I would love to show them again too. So mice, this is what I feel like recently what I'm most known for. Everyone always asks me about the mice. And the main question I get is, why mice? So I thought I would address that here today. But first I want to show you guys this piece. This piece is titled What Goes Up. This was another remake of a piece I made when I was a student at Mass Art. I don't have any pictures of the original one because I just didn't take any then for some reason. And the original one was all clear glass, clear balloons, clear mice, clear everything that I could find. I was really into clear glass at the time. But later I wanted to recreate it in color and make it a little bit more real and lifelike. So this piece, I think this is a good time to talk about why mice, right? So my very first pet that was my own pet was a little white mouse named Jerry. And mice they just don't live very long, unfortunately. People refer to them as creatures of 1,000 days. I don't even think my little Jerry made it to 1,000 days. So when he did pass away, I buried him underneath a really beautiful pink flowering tree we had out front of our home. And it sounds like this really beautiful poetic moment of a kid learning about death and loss, but I was such a curious, weird little kid that I couldn't leave it at that. Every day I kept just going out there and digging this mouse up to see what was happening to it, until one day it just wasn't there anymore. So I think this piece was a way for me to recreate and reimagine that moment of where the mouse went or where he's going. And I know that some people will see this and they're not sure if the mouse is dead or it's sleeping. It could be either. I don't really care which one you think it is. If it helps you like it better that it's sleeping, then it's sleeping. Here's another little close-up of those guys looking up at them. This piece is Mouse Family. This is a collaboration with my husband, Dave. He made all the little habit trail tubes that the mice are crawling in and out of. So when I was studying the mice for the piece I had just shown you guys, I wanted to get some pet mice. So me and my husband went to the pet store and we got 2 pet mice. The first 2 we got were Cherry and Ruby, super cute little mice that I love so much. And we ended up kind of transforming part of a room in our house to just be their habitat. We had different shelves. We would spend time rearranging the tubes and making it really fun and interactive for them. And we just had so much fun with it together. We got to know these 2 little mice, and they're so social and so playful and have such individual personalities. So I think this was a way to celebrate that and dive deep into that. We had a lot of fun making this together. In this piece here, in this picture here on the right, you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, this little piece of poop right there. So those of you that have had mice, whether they're pets or pests, you know where there's mice, there's mouse poop. And I can remember I had this piece set up on the table, just taking photos of it, which is one of the last steps of making a piece. And Dave come over and he looked at it and he's like, it's missing, right? And we just looked at each other and started laughing. So I had to stop everything, couldn't finish taking pictures until we figured out how to make the perfect little mouse poop. And it's like 2 or 3 pieces scattered about in this piece. This is Mouse Play. This is another fun piece I wanted to make just to celebrate mice and their playfulness. They're super fun and playful, and each one has their own personality, like I mentioned, and I wanted that to be shown in this piece. Sometimes when I'm sculpting them, I have an intention of what they're going to look like or what kind of personality I'm going for. Sometimes it just happens while I'm sculpting them. And I know that with white mice or mice in general, people have different associations with them. They might think of pet mice like I do, or they might think of lab mice, or they might even think of the mice that they would feed to their pet snake. And I'm okay with that. I like the idea of people having different associations and feelings with the mice. Another one of this little guy. So this is Candy Crush, another newer piece. Again, I just wanted to celebrate mice in their fun little sneaky ways. I really tried to push the realism with the candy here. Spent a lot of time figuring out how to make these lollipops. I probably made 10 to 20 of them, figuring out the colors to use and the process to get it just right. Here's a little close-up of that piece. I think my favorite details in these pieces is a little part on the bottom where you see the candy that's stuck on the lollipop stick after it got crushed off. I had to crush a lot of real and glass lollipops to make that happen. So I can look at it and study it, see what it looks like. And those little tiny pieces stuck to the stick aren't just drawn on. I actually picked up tiny shards and stuck them on there that way. This is Candy Crush 2, so another piece in that little series. I often have the mice interacting with each other or interacting with you, the person looking at it. So here it's kind of both, where they're working with each other, but if you're standing over it, that little mouse is looking up at you. And here's a good close-up of the mouse. Here you can really see how the stick of the lollipop isn't just stuck onto the bottom. What I actually did was I made the top part of the lollipop and I really carefully drilled the perfect size hole at just the right angle to put the lollipop stick inside. Because anytime I can treat the glass the same way the real object behaves or is, I try to do that. And I did that here too, where I took some of the finished lollipops and I just wrapped them in a rag and hit them with a hammer so that I could get the broken little pieces of candy. And I did that with the real ones too, so I can kind of compare and see if the broken pieces of glass would look the same as broken candy. And it's pretty similar, surprisingly. And more candy. This time I used gumdrops, which surprisingly, I actually don't like gumdrops. I have a big thing of gumdrops at my studio that I'll never eat to study them. And you just see all the colors. But I do love the way they look. They're such an iconic candy. So this one is titled Yellow is My Favorite. And you can actually see on the right side a little bit, you can see that this mouse actually has a little piece of the candy in his mouth. So he's actually eating it. I like to do like little details where people won't see them right away until they get a little bit closer, and then they start to see the little details. This is a sister piece to that. It's called Yellow is My Favorite Too. Just totally having fun with the titles here, obviously. And this piece, I just wanted to have the mice interacting again together. But the other one just has the one mouse, so he's kind of on his own. But these guys, there's a little story there where they're together. And here's a close-up of this guy. So when I'm sculpting them, like I mentioned before, sometimes I have a very intentional pose that I want to do, and I have all my reference images. And sometimes I just kind of get on the torch and start sculpting them and figure out the position as I go. And sometimes I design two and I sculpt them that way, so they'll go together. Other times I sculpt a bunch and I'll just play with them on my desk until I find what kind of story is going on there, and then I take it from there. And a little bit about the process, which is kind of my favorite thing to talk about as a glass nerd here. So making the mice is not easy at all and has not come easy. I've been sculpting them for about 10 years or so, on and off, of course. Sometimes there was years where I didn't sculpt any at all. But each time I did start working on them again, I really try to improve the process and just up the ante on the amount of detail I can fit in there. I try new positions and new colors, and I get new tools in my toolbox. Here you can see I'm using on the left side a Bunsen burner, which is a way to keep the glass really nice and warm without overheating it. I just got one of these maybe 2 years ago, and I don't know how I ever lived without one. I was actually talking about it with Demetra yesterday. If you don't have a Bunsen burner and you're a flame worker, get a Bunsen burner. It's the best. I love it. I would say my favorite part, which I spend way too much time on, are the little feet and the little toes. As you can see here, I'm using on the left, you can see is a really tiny torch with a really tiny flame. I call it the baby torch. Really, it's technically called a Smith torch. And you can change out the tips to get different size flames. And I use a really small tip. I think I'm using a 3 or 4 tip here. And I also wear jeweler's magnifying glasses, or else I wouldn't at all be able to see what I'm doing. I can't sculpt something I can't see, right? So when I'm wearing the jeweler's visors and I'm really in there doing the teeny tiny work, the movements are so small. And by the end of working on them for an hour or so, I definitely feel like a crazy person when I take off those glasses. But it's really tedious, meticulous work, but I love it. I feel like the piece wouldn't be right without the tiny little toenails. And when the piece is done too, I make sure that the toenails and eyes and nose remain shiny while I sandblast the rest of the mice so they get a nice soft finish. So the mice are so small. Sometimes I just want to blast my torch and make things bigger. And that's where these buddies come into play. They're much bigger than the mice and a whole different vibe on the torch. This piece is titled Uplift. And the dots and base are fused and slumped glass, and the bunny is all flame worked glass. I like to sculpt animals that I have relationships or memories with. My growing up in Revere, which is the city I grew up in just north of Boston, my neighbor behind us had a bunch of rabbits and chickens, sometimes pigs, which was, again, not at all normal for our very suburban neighborhood. So I really used to spend a lot of time in the yard watching these rabbits and just loving watching them. So rabbits are a really cool animal that I love. So when designing these pieces, I think of each one as a page in a book, like not telling an entire story, but just a little snapshot of it. Kind of like a 3D illustration. This is Rome. Again, thinking of an illustration. I love children's books, and I especially love the pictures in them. I love the ability of the illustrations to communicate an idea or a moment or an action in a really fun, simple, approachable way. I especially love the use of animals and other imaginary fun characters that take the place of humans in the stories.
I wanted to jump in just for a second, Trina. We had a question from someone that is applicable to both the bunnies as well as the mice, which is that you are really the expression is more in the body than in the face of your animals. And so they're asking, how do you process the bodily or facial expression?
Well, I think I understand the question. So in a technical way, what I do with the bunnies is I kind of doodle everything out. And then I made a really, well, it's kind of messy. I wouldn't even show you guys it because it's totally messy, but I made a wire armature and I put some clay over it that I can kind of really roughly move around into different positions. So I can kind of get a rough idea of the position I want the bunny to be in.
Oh, interesting.
Generally, all of them tend to be a little bit maybe sad. I'm not sure, just because they're kind of have that downward ears and stuff. I also will, in a funny way, make my husband take pictures of me in these positions. So I'll be standing on the edge of some, especially one I'm going to show soon. And this one actually was sitting on the edge just to see how the arms would go and in what position, how far out they would go and how far back they would go. So I have my husband take a lot of pictures of me, or I take pictures of other people, and I'll model my clay model that way before I go to the glass for sure. I think that's one of the hardest parts, is like understanding which way the body parts move, because although it's an imaginary character, it still has to follow some rules of anatomy. I can break them, but it can be kind of weird if you break them in a very strange way.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Of course, of course. Interrupt anytime with questions. I like questions. Okay, so this is Edge, and this guy, again, Flameworks, fused in slumped glass base. I often will include with the bunnies a base or some elements, whether they're made in the kiln or made in the hot shop. It really allows me to expand on the idea, not just in scale, but also in concept or idea. That way, it's not just one single object. It creates like a whole scene or that whole page, that whole illustration. And here's just a little detail of that guy. This is crepe. With this guy, I love that the elements he comes with can be rearranged. So again, like I mentioned before, I love installation and transforming a space, but I also understand that installations aren't the most accessible thing. I know that not everyone has a place in their home for a glass swing and 450 flowers on their floor, but I do love that something like this is a lot more accessible, and you can put it on a shelf and you can rearrange these separate elements and make it fit wherever you need it to go. And this is actually the one on the left is yours, Aaron. That's Gaze. And the one on the right is Glimpse. These pieces I made at the same time. And these pieces, again, incorporating blown glass element to make the piece finished and larger too. And each one of these comes with a separate sphere or dot that can be placed in different places. So you can play with it and have fun with it. And here you can see a detail of how the feet of this guy actually sink into the blown form. What I do here is, after making the bunny, is I make a mold of the feet. So I have sort of like a plaster positive in the shape of the feet. So then when I'm in the hot shop and I'm making this big blown sphere, I can heat up the top and press in that temporary like little positive of the feet. So then when I take the piece after, it'll stand perfect. It's a little tricky, and I generally have to make like 2 or 3 of these pieces for it to come out just right. And the ones that don't work just get chucked. And here's another detail. This guy also sinks into it. It really like gives them a lot of like weight, makes them feel heavy. So this guy is Mosey. With Mosey, I wanted to play with having the bunny and the dots be more interactive with the space, really letting it drop off the edge, not just the dots, but also the bunny himself. And I love that this bunny's like super casual and chill, even though at any point he could just kind of walk off the edge and fall to his death. Another detail of that guy. This is Spot. This was a commissioned piece I made last year, and surprisingly, I know you guys have seen so much color in the images I've shown you already, but one of my most favorite colors to work with is gray. And I love that these pieces, and when I take pictures of them, it looks like a black and white photo, even though it's a color photo. So gray is actually one of my most favorite colors, surprisingly. This is one of the recent ones. I showed this with Habitat not that long ago. These are 2 separate pieces, but I love that they can also be combined and become one piece. This is Dilly Dally. So again, 2 different pieces. So generally, I sandblast all the bunnies, all the ones you've seen before I have, but I had these ones in my studio working on them, and I was planning to sandblast them. I had everything all ready to go, but everyone in my studio and myself too were just like, they look so good shiny. Like I can't do that to this one. So with these ones, I decided to leave them shiny. Sometimes you really just gotta let glass be its glassy, awesome self. This is the yellow one. With the titles of the bunnies, Again, I just try to have fun with it and not overthink it at all. Tessa, one of my studio assistants and friends, she helps me a lot with setting the titles, and we have fun with it. I use thesaurus.com and I'll type in random words and see what other words come up until I find just the right word that fits with each bunny. For a while, I was titling everything. I wanted everything to just be untitled because I didn't want to tell the viewer too much about the story or what to think. But I do try to and need to have it because I make too much stuff and I won't know what's what. So having a title helps with that, but also gives a little bit of the story and vibe, but not too much. So that's kind of the goal when I get these. I don't want to tell too much of the story. I want to leave it a bit more open-ended. So bunny process. The bunnies are assembled over many days. Sometimes it takes me weeks or months, depending how slow I'm working and how often I get to get on the torch, because as you guys know, I have a few other jobs too. And it all starts with a drawing and a plan. And like I mentioned before, I do have a clay model. I'll take pictures. I draw everything out and I make a plan down to the T of like how much glass I'm going to use for each element, what wall weight I'm going to use, what length, so that I can use the same length of glass and the same wall thickness for one arm as I use for the other one. And I take notes on that in case I sculpt a leg all the way through and then the leg breaks and then I'm stuck with one leg and I have to recreate a matching one. So I take really detailed notes of the process as I go to protect myself later, which I've learned the hard way. So I try to not do that again.
So just to clarify regarding the coloration, Trina,
Mhm.
for everyone, you're actually starting with clear tubes,
Yes.
right? So,
Mhm.
so each of those pieces that you see in that previous slide, it all began as a clear tube, and she had to go through various layers of applying color and blowing out each one separately before moving on to the assembling process that you'll see in the next one.
Mm-hmm. And I pretty much always, I don't want to say always, but I very, very often work hollow. Actually, I'm sorry to say I'm not very good at sculpting solid. I have a really hard time with it because it's like when you move the material, it displaces and goes somewhere else. But with a bubble, if you push the material, it can go in, it can go wherever you need it to go because I can push out and add mass with air, or I can push in and there's space inside to take that away. So it can be like additive and subtractive at the same time, which really works for me and how I sculpt. So, and this one here, you can see I'm putting on one of the last pieces, which is the ears. And the ears are actually one of the scariest parts, I think, because it's the last couple pieces that go on. And the piece at this point has gotten pretty heavy. There's so many hours and time and sweat and sometimes tears inside these pieces. And if I make a mistake at this point, the whole thing could be gone. But that's glass, right? And here you can see more of the process. On the right, you can see lots of bridges. And bridges are actually, I got to thank Sally again. I learned about bridging in one of her classes. Thanks again, Sally. And it totally opened up so many doors for me when it comes to making these sculptures. Because say I'm trying to attach an arm or a leg or an ear, if I'm trying to work in the connection point, it starts to get really hot and moves around. So if I can temporarily connect it to something more solid, then I can really work in that seal and that connection and make the sculpture a lot smoother and stronger. And I often work on a few of them at a time because I find that if I work on just one, because it goes in and out of the kiln a lot, I need some time to sit there. I might get distracted and want to work on a couple other things at a time because my to-do list is always really long. So when I'm on the torch, I try to do just the one thing. So if I'm going to make bunny, I'm going to make 2 or 3 bunnies at a time so that my head's really in it. And also just the repetition. If I'm going to make legs, I'll make all the legs in one day. And then by the end, I really have learned something new to add to my notes so that the next time I make them, I'm even better at it. And sometimes I need assistance, especially towards the end and finishing the pieces. Here you can see one of my assistants and friend Alex helping me out. I know it's such a dorky phrase, but teamwork really does make the dream work. There's a lot of stuff here that I couldn't do on my own. Sometimes I think I can, and I'll start it, and then Alex is working on the table across from me, and I'll be like, Alex, quick, come over here. I need a hand, and he'll just drop everything, come over, grab a torch, and help me with what I need. But after that happening a few times with the bunnies, I know which part I need help on, and I'll plan for that, and I'll say, hey, in a few minutes, I'm going to work on this part, and he'll be ready there to give me what I need. So like I mentioned before too, I make a lot of the elements in the hot shop, and I am super lucky to work at Mass Art and have access to the hot shop there. Shout out to Jeff again for helping me blow glass in the hot shop. So there I'm able to make pieces a lot larger and sometimes faster. And I am limited by scale and at the flame shop. And although we do have some lathes in the studio now, there is only so much you can get in scale. So if I wanted like a 14-inch sphere, that's a hot shop game for sure. So more bunnies, can't get enough bunnies, right? So this is actually an older series that I hope to make more of soon. And one of my most favorite, this one is I call the Overgrown series, and it's a collaborative series with my husband, Dave. He makes all the glass flowers, which as you can see here are absolutely ridiculously beautiful and detailed. He does a lot of stuff inspired by the Blashka flowers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. They're the glass flowers. So lucky to have in my backyard, right at Harvard. And they're still realistic. So he's gone and he's studied those and tried to recreate and reinvent that whole process. So I was sculpting bunnies, like stuffed bunnies and stuffed bears and animals pretty often. I never felt like they were finished. I had like, I think 2 or 3 in the studio, and they were just sitting there. I didn't photograph them. I didn't share anything with them. I just made them because I wanted to make them, but they never felt like a finished piece to me. I didn't have like the complete thought. It was just an object. And then one day Dave was like, you know what, why don't we put some plants growing out of it? Like the earth is taking it over. And it just was like the perfect answer to the problem. And it made it a complete piece. And he is so good with knowing what plants and mushrooms we can take a hike in the woods, and he knows pretty much what all the mushrooms we walk by are called and everything about them. I know nothing about that. So if you guys want to know what these are, reach out to him. He'll know exactly what they are. So that brings me to my newest series. This series I've been calling Display Things. They're playful glass sculptures that you want to play with, but probably shouldn't. And first up in that series I've been working on for the past few years are the fragile finger monsters. So these are the real ones. I don't know if you guys remember these. They were a big part of my childhood, and these are like plasticky little rubber finger puppets. And I can remember getting them like as you exit the grocery store and like asking your mom for a quarter so you can get one of these in the machine. Or if I went to the dentist and I was really good, I could pick a toy out of the box of toys, and this was always the toy that I picked. So when I came across them again as an adult, I saw them and I was like, these have got to be glass. They're like screaming to be made out of glass. So that's what I did. And these are some really old ones, as you can kind of tell by looking at them. So I made them like just for fun, and I just made my own characters that I made up. I didn't think too hard about it. I made them and I would give them to my friends and family for Christmas or their birthdays. And I just kind of made them once in a while. And so one day I took these monsters and I went outside to take pictures of them in the sun because glass looks so good in the sun. And my neighbor across the way, who every day I would come into work and I would see him and we would wave hello, but there's a language barrier. He doesn't speak any English at all. So we would just wave hello and there wasn't really much more to it. But he saw me out there and he so excitedly ran over and gestured that he wanted to play with one of the puppets. So of course I let him. And we had just like this hilarious, fun moment and this connection that otherwise wouldn't have happened at all. And then after that, we kind of became friends, even though we wouldn't really talk much. I taught him how to hula hoop. He like got some other tennis game he tried to play one time with me. And it just, you know, these little toys, the silly thing I was making actually had a power, right? They could connect people and make them smile. So down the rabbit hole I went, and I spent a lot of time perfecting them. As you can see, they have a lot of detail in them, from their teeth to all their tiny little spikes. I made pretty much every character that there was. I went and got all the real ones so I could model them after them. I made them to scale. Sometimes I would make them a little bit bigger so they can fit the adult finger a little bit better. And I made every single character in all different fun color combinations too. And I decided I also wanted to have custom boxes made and designed for them too. So that way, when you got one, you could enjoy the whole process, you know, like the getting a toy when you're a kid and opening that box and finding that toy inside. So I wanted that whole experience. But I also wanted to make a finished sculpture with them. So this is one of the first ones I did, and this one's titled Confrontation. So here I cast 2 glass hands into very recognizable poses, and I wanted them to hold the monsters. The idea was to use the monsters to break the tension of the gestures, using that special silly power I was telling you guys about. So here's the piece without the monsters. To me, it's cool, but it's so boring, right? But you add the monsters, so much better. It takes away all that negativity and just makes it silly and fun, which I love.
So the finger monsters are flame worked, and again, you're starting with the clear tubing to create those. They're not solid sculpted.
They're hollow, but I coil pot. And actually, after this, I have a lot about the process of these guys, because at this point, I got a lot better at documenting my process. So in a minute, I'm going to get into deep process combo.
Okay. All right.
Mhm.
We did have a question from someone too that was just kind of curious about your interest in childhood characters and wanted to know if there are any fairy tales or other children's characters that you are looking forward to exploring in the future.
That's a good question. I like them all. I'm kind of like, I liked all the older Disney movies, and now that I spend a lot of time with my niece and nephew, my niece is 3, so I've been watching a lot of cartoons, and I'm definitely inspired by them. But I don't often like to directly make a character that already exists. I like to make my own character. With these monsters is probably one of the only exceptions, because I feel like I'm recreating a toy. But when it comes to characters, I prefer to like design and make my own character. I feel like there's a little more freedom in that.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. I included this picture just because I wanted to show that when you cast the hands, you get so much detail. You can really see like all the wrinkles in the fingers, and on the other side, you can see the fingerprints too. It's crazy how much detail is retained in the casting process. And here's just that whole crew together. So this piece is titled Party of 5. Here, I just really wanted to make a set playing with color and not doing them in the colors that they came in, but doing my own fun color palette. I wanted a nice soft pastel palette. And as you can see, like, I remember when I was a kid, I would put a monster on every finger, and you don't worry about it because they're rubber and they bang against each other. But I wanted to make that moment here. And I found that Alex had the biggest hand in the studio. So this hand is Alex's, so it can fit the most monsters on it because it could spread out the furthest. And I made each monster specifically for each finger, so it only fits on each finger. And they're dangerously close to one another. So if those were to wiggle, they could break and clank against one another. And here's these views close up. Again, I just wanted to play with soft colors. And some of these colors are what we call like shifty colors, where in some light they look one way and another light they look another way, which is a really fun thing about these colors. That guy on the left's kind of scary, I think, but I still like him. This one's one of my favorites. So this is the limited set I made for Habitat. I do believe some of these are still available. Aaron is here, so he could tell you. And so this set comes in a custom box. It comes with 2 hands, a tall one and a short hand, and 2 of the puppets. And these are all the colors available for that. When Aaron approached me and wanted me to make a set for that, I really wanted it to be glassy. So I chose really pretty transparent colors, and I left them all in their original glassy state. On the bottom, I did bring that bottom part to a high polish as well. So everything's really glassy and shiny. So a bit about the process, like you asked. So this process is so involved for such a tiny thing. And I really refined this process during COVID. I guess it was one of the things to come out of it that was positive, where I had so much time in the studio, but they weren't teaching and stuff. So I really got to dive really deep into this process here. So the first step is choosing the color. And although you guys can see, I use a lot of color in my work. In borosilicate, there are so many colors available now that weren't available when I started, and they keep coming out with new ones. And a lot of the fun new ones are transparent and really bright and awesome, but I don't really have a place for them anywhere else in my work. But here I can use all of them. So when I started making these, I pretty much ordered every fun transparent color there was. And actually the orange one was pretty hard to find. And when I finally did find it, I bought so much of it just in case they ran out or stopped making it. So with these pieces, all the elements I kind of treat as their own little sculpture. So if I'm sculpting the mouth, I try to think of that as its own individual thing. And I'll make the mouth, and I make part of it and I bring it to the cold shop, and I kind of be a little monster dentist and take my Dremel and a sintered bit, and I grind away every tooth to be really nice and pointy and shiny. It took me a while to get to this realization that this is what I needed to do. I had done using the Smith torch and my magnifying glasses, try to put in every single tooth individually, but it wasn't looking like I wanted it to look. So it took me a while of obsessing about it and a lot of experiments and mess ups and broken glass to get to realize how to do this part. And sometimes I go back between flame shop, flame shop, cold shop, like 2 or 3 times before the element is even ready for assembly. So here again, you can see all the parts made, ready to assemble. And before I assemble everything, I do make all the parts. More little process shot here. And they're pretty tiny. I remember the first ones I made, I just like overshot how big it is. Every time I sculpt something small, one of the first things I do when I make it is I make it too big accidentally. So I had to keep kind of going back to the drawing board and scaling things down and down and down until they were at the actual scale that the real one was. And one of the most important things about making these pieces is keeping them hot. Those of you that work with glass know that if you're working with hot glass and it gets too cold, it's going to crack and break. These pieces, the monsters, love to crack and break because I'm breaking a lot of the glass rules here. There's a lot of tight lines and tight angles. Generally, you don't want an angle to be less than 90 degrees. Here, there's quite a few of those. And I found I can get away with it as long as I keep the whole piece really, really warm while I'm working on it and anneal it properly, which means cool it down slowly to room temperature. Here again, you can see on the right that I'm using that Bunsen burner that I love so much. A lot of the pieces don't make it, and a lot of them do just break. And sometimes people are like, can't you rescue it or can't you save it? And no, not really. Sometimes I want to, but then you'll see the scar and the crack and the break. And some of these hurt really bad because that color on top, that transparent pink, is actually a really expensive color. And then they make it, but the party's just started because there's still more work to do. And if they make it through the process of being made on the torch, they need to go back to the cold shop again. So instead of just melting them off the tube, I actually use my saw and I cut them off the tube, and then I'll grind the bottom really nice and flat and bring it to a high polish if I want to keep it shiny. And if I don't want to keep it shiny and I do want that soft sandblasted or like satiny type finish, then I sandblast them. And here you can see everyone asks me about this stuff whenever I post about it, and I'm happy to share this. It's one of my favorite new things I discovered. Actually, Joy Munchauer, the bead maker, turned me on to this stuff. But you can, it's kind of works, this etch all resist gel kind of works the way Elmer's glue does. And I've used Elmer's glue in the past, but the stuff works way better. And you can brush it onto anything you want to remain shiny and let it dry. And then when you sandblast, it protects those areas. And then afterwards, you can kind of just peel it right off. So anywhere that I brush on this resist gel will remain nice and shiny, and everything else will stay nice and matte. So sometimes I will paint it onto the point of every spike, or I want to make sure the nostrils or the teeth stay shiny, and then the rest of it gets that nice matte finish. Then of course they get all cleaned up and get an adorable back. And here's more, guys. I had fun making like all the characters and playing with the color combinations. And casting. So casting is, I have to say, first we were talking about this yesterday, Demetria, that casting is so messy. Every time I cast in my studio, I have to clear off the whole table. And now my studio for the day is a casting studio, or I'm working with wax because generally we're flame working there. So here you can see we're making a mold of my hand, and then we make a wax positive so we can do the lost wax casting process.
And we did have a question on the hand molds. I think they are wondering what type of investment you're using for making your molds. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the mix or ratio.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start at this part, but I will talk about the investment. So I tried a bunch of different ways, and I will say I'm okay at casting. I'm pretty good at it, but I don't do it all the time. So I know how to make the finished piece and make it well, but it's really so involved. And oftentimes, I don't know if Dan Clayman tuned in, but he's kind of my mentor when it comes to casting, and he's helped so much. But the process is so involved, and I'm pretty good at it with certain parts, but some of it I feel like there's people that are way better at it than me. But here I started by making all my hand molds using body double, which is a little bit more expensive and gets a lot more higher detail. So you can start here and then you can pour the wax right into that mold. But I found that that mold doesn't hold up really well for a bunch of waxes if I wanted to cast a lot of them. I switched my process up a little bit. This is actually Tessa. She's modeling for the confrontation piece. So what I started doing more recently is making alginate molds, where we'll cast the mold in the alginate and then I pour plaster. So then I'll have a plaster hand, and then I'll make a rubber mold off of that. So I have a much stronger mold to get lots of waxes from. And here's one of the Alex's one. Yeah, so before I go too far, so the investment material, I don't have any pictures of that. I've been using the R&R 101, which I find works really well. They have a couple other products as well that are made for things that are bigger and need more strength too. So we're almost to the end. So talk a little bit about some of the new things I have in the works. Those of you that follow me on Instagram, I've been posting a lot of videos and pictures of the rats. And rats aren't just large mice, they're so different. So when I'm sculpting them, although I do have that base knowledge of the anatomy of a mouse that does apply a little bit, they are a lot different. And scaling up like this, making it so much bigger, makes it a lot harder. So these pieces actually use about 10 inches of 51 millimeter white tubing. So flame workers know that that's big and that's a lot. And I have to start at the lathe because I really can't handle that much weight just at the bench. And I condense that down, and then I'll bring it to the bench to sculpt it and shape it and form it. And this is actually what I plan to demonstrate at the IFC in March.
Yeah, maybe we should give a couple quick details on that, Trina, since people might be in the area.
Yeah, definitely. It's actually in the next slide, so I'll do that in a second.
Okay, great.
Cool. Thanks. So this is just a really quick studio shot. I haven't shared any pictures of this at all. It's kind of my secret project right now. So this is the first time anyone sees anything about it. And I've been wanting to make this piece since like 2010. It's been in my sketchbook. And I remember as a student, I kept trying to make these pieces, but I just didn't have the hot shop skills then to make them. They didn't come out right, so I never finished them. So I finally am making them. And I don't know if you guys remember, I talked a little bit about earlier when you go to the grocery store or wherever and you walk out and they have those machines with the toys, and they have those little toy capsules. They're just the acorn toy capsules, they call them. So I'm making those, except you can't tell the scale of these. They're actually 8 inches across. And I'm making all the toys that come in them. So I'm making bouncy balls and sticky hands and all that fun stuff. And I'm hoping to have some of these done for the Glass Coast weekend. So here's all the upcoming shows and events I have going on. So at IFC at Salem Community College, I'll be doing a demonstration there, and I'll be demonstrating a rat. And I'll be part of Habitat's Glass Coast weekend. I'm sure Aaron has more of the details on that. And also I'll be doing a group show at Sandwich Glass Museum here in New England, in Massachusetts. I don't have the details of that one yet, but I will be sharing those on my social media when I do have them. So if you want to stay connected with me, Instagram is probably the best way. If you don't use Instagram, I'm also on Facebook, and you can visit my website, which I update pretty often, that has everything and all the upcoming shows that I'll be doing. And that's all I got. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Trina. Someone was wondering about the conference. Is that open to can anyone purchase a conference ticket or?
Yeah, I believe, yeah, totally. I believe so. Mm-hmm. Sally,
right.
Want to weigh in here? Are you here? Is everyone muted? She's a big part of it.
Yeah, you can already, I registered already. It's a great thing to go to. And you are the featured artist, so it's going to be awesome.
Sally.
So go for it.
It's really fun. I went for the first time last year and I had such a great time. So when they reached out to me to be a demonstrator and the featured artist, I was first off a little bit nervous, but also really excited because I had such a great time. So I'm really looking forward to it.
And also Mary Childs was able to put a little information in the chat about the show at the Sandwich Museum that you mentioned.
Oh, great.
So yeah, it is going to be in the summer, part of an exhibition called Creatures Great and Small. So it's also going to include the work of Mariel Bass, Claire Kelly, and Jen Violette. So there will be plenty of sculpture from differing viewpoints about animals. So,
I love that title. It's perfect.
yeah. And it runs from June 30th to October 29th. Thank you, Mary.
Awesome. I'm happy to answer any questions about process and stuff too, of course.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the casting. I know sometimes when people see something being created through a mold, they think it's so easy, and they, aren't able to see the failures and sort of the amount of detail that goes into that. Even the type of plaster you use affects how much detail you're able to pick up and what type of finishing work needs to be done. So maybe you can talk a little bit either about the flow of the glass and problems with getting, into all those nooks and crannies, or different examples of failures you have experienced along the way.
So many failures. I feel like that's the best and worst way to learn, but that's how you learn so much, right? With the hands, they're pretty straightforward. Everything flows into all those parts really well because it's, has enough space. The smaller the piece is, the harder it is for the glass to flow in there. But I feel like the biggest lesson I took away from casting is, again, and I do this with all my pieces, is take really detailed notes. So that way, because I don't cast every day or every week or even every month, I actually haven't cast anything in about a year. So if I went to go cast hands again, I'd be a little bit forgetful about the mistakes I'd already made and wouldn't want to repeat them. So having my notebook with all of my detailed notes of what went right and what went wrong, what kiln I used and what temperature that kiln went to, what amount of glass I used for what piece, and was that enough or was it too much? So really detailed notes, I feel like, is my biggest tip. When it comes to materials, because I don't cast a lot, I generally have really basic things that I kind of repeat. I've been using the 101 a lot that I mentioned, the Ransom and Randolph stuff that I'm happy to send a link or share on my Instagram. And I've really been enjoying that material to use for casting, and the company itself will answer all your questions too. So there was a couple issues that I had and I called them and they really helped me with troubleshooting everything. When it comes to glass and what type of glass, I somehow got my hands on a bunch of the old System 96, and that's what I've been casting with. Eventually I'll run out of that and have to find something new, but that's what I've been using. But I can't really recommend other people to use it because they don't even make it anymore. So I'm not sure what a lot of other people use it, maybe gaffer, or I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't really consider myself a caster. Like, I do cast glass when the piece calls for it. But I feel like I'm more of a flame worker than I am anything else.
We do have another question from Morgan. He wants to know, do you use any particular strategy for taking and organizing your notes so that things are easy to reference in the future?
Yes. And I wish they were as neat as I want them to be, but once in a while I get really into it. And I say notebook, but really what I started with a notebook, but what I've been doing is I have a binder with those little plastic sheets. So that way, when I am working and I want to print out, say, some reference material that the company gives, I can print it out and I can put it inside those sheets and I can refer to it, like how much water it needs, how much weight, how much time to mix for. I can see all that there. And it's in the plastic sheet so that when everything's really messy and there's plaster and water all around, that they don't get ruined. And then I take notes just on more paper and I'll just put it more in those plastic sheets, and I'll just use those little tabs and a label maker to label each one. So I can be like, okay, I cast the hand last year. Here's the hand in this position. Here's the hand in that position. I'll draw everything out in the weights. And if I know I use too much plaster, I'll say this weight was too much. Next time, try this.
Very interesting. Yeah, the plastic sheets is a great idea because things do get pretty messed up in the studio.
Yes. They do.
Well, it's really interesting. The movement in your work is so natural. And I think that the process that you use with the wire cage that you mentioned and covering it in clay to kind of work through some of those movements ahead of time is such an interesting part of your process. And I think that's something that, might seem so simplistic when someone looks at the work, just because they aren't thinking about perhaps the process and what it takes to get sort of that natural slump or that natural, bend of the head. And you really do such an exceptional job in the gestures and ways that your figures and animals move.
Thanks. It definitely is really tricky. And sometimes there's some rejects. I definitely have a case of them in my studio where they just look wrong. And sometimes I can't even pinpoint what it is.
Yeah.
I'm so lucky to have, well, my husband's really, really good at sculpting, and he is so awesome to like sit down with and be like, what, look at this with me and help me figure out what's going on with it. And early on, when I went to Mass Art, one of the first things he always gave me advice, because he was a senior when I started as a freshman. And he was like, take the anatomy classes, take the sculpting classes. Even though you're doing glass, it's really important to understand the form and stuff that you're doing. And I always took all of his advice, and it's really served me well. And sometimes I go to sculpt something new and I get on the torch and I'm making it. And he'll even come over and be like, cool, that looks good. Did you sculpt it in clay first? And I'm like, no, I may have skipped that part. And to be like, you know what, you're right. I need to go back and follow the steps. And I try to teach that to my students too, is like, how can I step up to the torch and sculpt something that I don't understand with a material that's so hard to work with?
Right.
And I can work with in my hands and squish and move it around. And none of my clay sculptures, I would say, are finished, but they get to the point where I'm like, okay, I get it. And then I
Yeah.
can have it next to me while I'm making the piece of the torch.
Well, and I think also it's important to note that you're using tubing to create the works. And, unlike clay or even solid glass, where it can be a little bit more forgiving in the sense that if you move it the wrong way, you can squish it back somehow to the way that you want. Whereas when you're blowing and you're thinning the thickness of the wall of that tubing, there's so much that you can do once you have kind of pushed it the wrong way or blown it out too much in one direction. So I'm sure you've kind of, learned ways to navigate that process over time, but probably is also, a result of why you might have a few in the seconds bucket, just because it is, glass, and especially blown glass is something that's very hard to undo once you've kind of gone in a particular direction with it.
Definitely. There are more than a few in this, this bucket, and that's just part of the process. And like I said, I've been sculpting the rats. So it's the newest example I have. And I'm posting the pictures. Everyone's like, can I have that one? I want that one. I'm like, this one has a little crack. This one, the hands are way too big. This one, the tail didn't go on right. So there's always something that's not right in them that I'm working out. So it really takes me making something at least 10, 20, 30 times until I get it to a point where I'm like, okay, this feels right. It feels done. But all those failures are part of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And like you're saying, working hollow, it can be not at all forgiving sometimes, especially when you're talking about the wall weight and the wall thickness, when you're really sculpting and moving the material around, because you can run out of thickness. If I needed to like pull an arm out of one side and I try to do that and it's not thick enough, then it's way too thin and it's not going to work. So
Right.
when that happens, I'll go back to the drawing board and say, how do I shape this bubble to start with so that I have more mass and material over here where I need it? And every time I change the position of the mice or the rats, I have to rethink about that. So right now I've been working on 2, maybe 3 positions. And then once I really get the process down, then I'll start doing positions that are more dynamic.
Yeah, and I think that is, a little bit of the contradiction or struggle with glass, is that we love blown glass and hot glass for the immediacy of the moment and being able to blow and sculpt. But at the same time, once you get in there, and particularly as you start advancing your work and the complexity of what you're making, it does take more pre-planning than sometimes us as free spirits would like, but we realize we have to do.
Yes, sometimes I wish I didn't have to do that, and sometimes I don't, and then I regret it.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, and I'm like, wow, I just wasted 4 hours and so much time and money and glass when I could have made this much easier on myself by taking the time beforehand.
Yeah.
I think it was like, I remember when I got my sewing machine. I'm terrible at sewing, but I got a sewing machine. I was really excited to sew, but I realized you need to do so much prep work before you even get on the sewing machine. You need to cut the fabric and iron it, measure it and mark it, pin it together, and then you sew for such a short period of time. So I always think about that when I'm making a sculpture, is I need to spend all that time beforehand doing all the prep work, and
Right.
helps a lot. It's not as fun as just jumping on the torch, because that's what I want to do,
Yeah.
but it helps. It's necessary.
Well, and I'm sure being an educator also, it helps to get you in that mindset, because you can kind of step outside the process a little bit and say, if I was teaching one of my students, how would I have them approach it? And then that can kind of put you in a little bit more of a analytical, mindset, the creative mindset that we tend to prefer as artists. So.
So I was actually just saying that to my husband like yesterday, that I was like, I tell my students to do this and then I didn't. So I think I need to actually do what I'm telling them to do.
Yeah, totally. Well, does anyone have any more questions for Trina? Okay, well, looks like that is it. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Just such a diverse array of work. And as I said, to have such natural gestures within the work and expression is really phenomenal. And I'm such a huge fan of what you do, and look forward to seeing your work at the Sandwich Museum, as well as down at Glass Coast in Florida with Habitat. If anyone is interested in Trina's work, please do reach out either to her galleries or just to her directly via Instagram or her website. I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. So, all right.
Thanks for all coming.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Trina.
Thank you so much.